Hey everyone, I think I'm going to have to double down on what it is I've been talking about lately, which is let's just start from the top. So, Bitcoin's two things: it's a medium of exchange and it's a store of value. And those two things don't always pull in the same direction. Often one has to be sacrificed for the other to be better. But importantly, if either of them falls too far by the wayside, then neither of them can work. So, a perfect example was the block size wars, where people that are obsessed with Bitcoin being a medium of exchange, and increasing the block size as necessary to allow as many transactions as possible into the chain. Um, the We decided, or anyone with half a brain could figure out, if you do that, then the verification all drops and you don't have store of value anymore, because who's enforcing 21 million if it costs you, if you have to run a whole data center to be able to process what's going on the network? That's a non-starter. You don't have 21 million anymore. It's not Bitcoin. You just have another crap medium of exchange, and there's a billion of them in the world. The unique qualities of Bitcoin in that scenario wouldn't confer any sort of censorship resistance or any other great stuff. So, but conversely, and as is more hard to explain, but more reminiscent of every captured protocol that's out there already, is the idea that if Bitcoin isn't usable as a sovereign medium of exchange, that ultimately bleeds back to the store of value use case, and 21 million can stop being relevant in that context too. And unfortunately, the latter fight, I think it just never came down to anything technical. It wasn't technical with the big blockers, it was political. There was never a technical reason to make the blocks bigger. It was never a real solution to anything. And likewise, today there is a much more credible technical approach, which is the idea of coin pools and the other things that would be enabled by the Covenant's proposals, that would also improve Lightning in certain iterations of of how they're being discussed. That works. It's At least on paper, that's a brilliant idea for how you scale the medium of exchange element of what Bitcoin is. But the problem is, there is not a technical barrier to using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. I mean, there is one, but that is not why people aren't doing it. And this is what I mean when I say I have to double down on what I've been saying, which is people don't want to use Bitcoin that way. And that's a problem, because if they don't, then we lose the ability to do it in any practical sense. Once Bitcoin becomes another order of magnitude and of adoption, and 90% of the people using it being normies that are just using it like any standard third-party payment processor, with regard to the medium of exchange element of it, if that becomes the case, as a deep OG Bitcoiner, in order to interact with the world that's increasingly adopting Bitcoin, you have to step inside the walled garden, and you can't be sovereign either, because the payment rails everyone else is using are all permissioned. And that is the world we're headed towards. Where I disagree with almost everyone, it seems, is the big blockers propose a solution. They imagine the reason that Bitcoin is not being used the way it needs to be used is because blocks are too small, which is just fake news. Absolutely not true. I'm going to cherry pick like I always do. 2 sats a byte, 2 sats a byte, 2 sats a byte. The last 4 blocks are all 2 sats a byte. So if you're doing a regular-ish transaction with 2 inputs and 2 outputs or whatever, you're spending maybe 12 cents or something to use Bitcoin in a completely permissionless way on the base layer. It's like last night I suddenly, internally at Ocean, we were looking at our nodes, and, we were comparing various mempools, and it's less than a Bitcoin to fill up an entire, less than a Bitcoin to, I mean, compare this. You've got over $1 trillion in value collectively that people are storing in Bitcoin as a store of value, and you have less than a Bitcoin in the entire planet of pending transactions, and that represents the value that we collectively hold in being able to write our transactions into an unchangeable ledger. To use Bitcoin as a permissionless medium of exchange, this other use case that is, the left and right leg of Bitcoin, the medium of exchange and the store of value. The store of value is just, it's become so utterly dominant in as becoming the raison d'etre for Bitcoin that I'm just genuinely shocked by it. And I mean, let me pull up this tweet by Jimmy. Jimmy Song tweeted a couple of weeks ago, what's your main use case for Bitcoin? And 94% of people said savings and 1.5% of people said method of payment. And there was a third option saying other, which are 4.5%, which presumably would include people that use it as both. But I can't believe how skewed that poll is. And Jimmy's, I would credit the audience, the people that follow Jimmy, with being some of the best people in the space. So, with the highest signal and the least amount of incentive to be shilling scam coins and stuff like that. So this is just concerning to me. And I don't think anyone that is presenting a solution is really taking the problem as seriously as they might. Because, like, I've seen the people that advocate for covenants talk about the horrors of having, no one can use Bitcoin permissionlessly anymore as a medium of exchange because block space is just too expensive because we've had another few waves of adoption. Therefore, everyone is just using a JP Morgan Bitcoin holding account and they move money around inside that permissioned system. And we need covenants, otherwise that's inevitable. The argument is almost right. And the technology to mitigate that is what they're focusing on, which is UTXO sharing. But the problem that I've highlighted on this channel before is that the willingness is not there, because we can look at the state of things right now. We're just around an all-time high. We've got the US president talking about us, paying massive homage to the Bitcoin community, even if it's all just talk. We have talk of the strategic Bitcoin reserve in America, and I'm not casting judgment on these things because my opinion is that they're probably bad more than good. But the point is, the attention that is on us at the moment and the adoption and the incoming wave of normies that we're seeing hasn't conflated to any use of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange at all, unless it's just people moving money around with third-party custodians and we're not able to see it, or mass adoption of the Lightning Network, which I strongly doubt. So let's be honest with ourselves. The monetary, the store of value use case for Bitcoin is amazing, but let me go back. Let's talk about history here. I didn't get into Bitcoin because of this revival of Austrian economics and gold standard 2.0, bug fix for gold and all that stuff. That's not why I got into Bitcoin. I got into Bitcoin for the uncensorable medium of exchange element, which unfortunately is just a lot harder to scale. And the obvious ways in which you might think about scaling it undermine the store of value thing. But the store of value thing was not obvious to me when I first got into Bitcoin. It really was, I can't send money to Julian Assange any other way. This is how I can do it, because Visa have blocked him and the other credit card processors and PayPal have all blackballed the guy. So the only way to send him Bitcoin is to send him money is using the Bitcoin network. And, it freaked Satoshi out because, he said it would have been nice to get this attention in any other capacity. And that's famously one of the last things he said. I don't know how close it was to him, disappearing in early 2011. But I don't think it was far off. Julian's a cypherpunk to the end, so he was going to be all about Bitcoin the minute it existed. But that was why I got there. I didn't know anything about Austrian economics or gold standard or any of this stuff. I had no clue about it. But the fact that it couldn't be printed was definitely an essential component of why I got interested in it. But it was, the two kind of came together, but the uncensorable peer-to-peer payment element of it was certainly what initially attracted me to it. And then all the other stuff came later, for the most part. But it was in the context of masses of money printing, the bailouts, etc. So that wasn't too far behind. But then during the block wars, the two use cases of Bitcoin that is constantly confusing and has to be unpacked every time you talk about it to newbies is the fact that Bitcoin is money an undebasable money, and it's also supposed to be an uncensorable payment network on which you move the money around. You have Bitcoin, the currency, and Bitcoin, the payment network, and they are both called Bitcoin. And that is confusing because you don't normally do that. A payment network isn't usually a currency, and a currency isn't usually a payment network. Bitcoin is both of them simultaneously. And like I said, the two things can work against each other at times. And the block size war was a big example of that. It was people that were like, payment network is all I freaking care about. Adoption, adoption, adoption. And to be honest, adoption of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange is really important, and it's really difficult to do and really difficult to bootstrap. But adoption as a store of value is trivial because everyone that does, relatively speaking, obviously 99% of people still haven't brought themselves to do it, but everyone that does it only has to wait a few years before they go, this was a great decision. I have now I'm on the way to making generational wealth. Adopting Bitcoin as a medium of exchange doesn't really change your life. It just makes everything a bit more inconvenient unless you go to some contrived island in the middle of nowhere, culturally speaking. So places like Lugano and places like El Salvador, where you actually might be able to, but even then, you have to go to islands within islands, like El Zonte in El Salvador, to be able to actually spend it. And it looks like that's on the decrease rather than the increase, given what happened with the IMF loan lately in El Salvador, where I think you might see some of the bigger stores disadopt Bitcoin as a medium of exchange too, because they were kind of expected to go along with it, I think, because the wording of the law was you do have to accept this unless you lack the technical competence. And that meant 99% of street vendors and small stores in El Salvador weren't using Bitcoin in that way, and they weren't expected to, but the bigger stores like the McDonald's and the Starbucks and places like that would. So that might stop now, which would suck. But anyway, I digress. What I'm really talking about here is you have these two use cases, and I do think, I don't want to be a doomer, but I do definitely think that the new wave of energy that came with this massive enthusiasm and this revival of the Austrian economic school of thought, and the people espousing the virtues of a gold standard that understand the limitations of it and why it's vulnerable to 6102. I think that, obviously Satoshi was a part of that, and it's a big part of the culture here, but it has actually gone too far now, where what was it that what was the poll result? Yeah, 94% of people are just buying Bitcoin and holding it. And that's a huge use case. I'm not going to accept anything from the other camp that says you're not using it if you're just holding it. That's obviously not true. But the point is the interactivity requirement there is almost zero, and it's go fuck yourself money to anyone that wants to try and relieve you of your self-custody. You can store it, but you don't need to interact more and more with people as that progresses. You buy it, you withdraw it, and you do nothing for the next 10 years if you like. You don't need the rest of the world really to do anything apart from do the similar thing to what you did and you need that to increase over time rather than decrease, and then the number will go up and you'll have a great experience and you'll create generational wealth. Okay, all that's fantastic, but the problem is fiat's dying and people need money. I don't mean they need wealth. I mean they need an instrument with which they can transact with one another. And the problem with that is counterparties, third parties are necessarily a part of that. You can hodl your Bitcoin and go from day 1 to day 2 to day 3 without interacting with anyone else, apart from the other nodes on the network you're using to verify that your coins are still where you think they are. Fair enough, but that's very easy and very scalable. You can just add more and more nodes to the network and everyone makes their yearly purchase of Bitcoin. Great, the network supports all that and it's a great store of value. But the problem is it's not just going to be used as a store of value. People are going to use it as a medium of exchange eventually if the money they use continues to break. And this is the point. This is where it gets weird, because adoption of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange is going to happen because something else breaks, because fiat just becomes too obviously unsustainable, and it is almost reaching that point. And when you get there, you have desperation and ignorance, and people using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange without any sovereignty at all. They're asking permission from a third party the entire time because they don't know any of the backstory here. They just got into Bitcoin because nothing else is working, and they're going to be using the equivalent of a Gmail server, right, to handle all their email for them. They're going to use these companies that do everything for them. You already see that with adoption of that was how adoption of Bitcoin in El Salvador went. It was always LSPs. It was never people running Lightning nodes and managing their own stuff. It was always someone else doing it on their behalf, which means no privacy, no sovereignty whatsoever. And the problem with that is if that takes off, a small amount of it doesn't affect the store of value use case. And store of value is an amazing feat for Bitcoin to have solved. It deals with all of the corruption in markets. It means people stop using real estate as a surrogate for the fact that there is no way to store value in currency anymore because it keeps getting debased. Fantastic. We solved the store of value, which is a really hard problem to solve. And we bootstrapped a new one from the off, which means if you got in at the beginning, you did so well, and that still is in process now. That's all great. But it's going to change. People are going to adopt it and start using it as a medium of exchange. I put in quote marks because they're not really going to be using Bitcoin anymore because the will is just simply not there. Trying to get people to onboard in Bitcoin and take custody of their coins is a hard battle. And it's so easy. I'm not going to say it's trivial, but it's pretty easy. And the amount of time you must commit to it is pretty low. Like if you want to do it the absolute gold standard way, it's still going to take you a few days max, and then you've done it for life. All you need to do, you can buy a cheap piece of hardware, run a node on it, run a wallet on top of it, get a signing device, generate a mnemonic, generate a Bitcoin address from that mnemonic, make an account with a Bitcoin exchange, buy a bunch of Bitcoin, withdraw it to the address. You can do this a small amount initially. Verify that you can recover that from the mnemonic, then withdraw as much as you're comfortable with, or buy as much as you're comfortable with, and withdraw it all to your Bitcoin addresses, and then do nothing for years after that, except maybe verify on your node that the coins are still where you think they are. That's it. There's no interactivity required beyond that, and you can learn to do that. Even as a total normie, you can learn to do that, and most people do. After a year or two of being in Bitcoin and having some coins on an exchange, they get into the culture, and people are saying, run a node, don't trust, verify, and you eventually do it. And you think, great. I'm going to run a node and I'm going to connect a wallet to my node. And there's all this great software out there like Umbrel and Start9, and I can do it really easily. And it's not going to cost me a fortune. I'm just going to buy a Raspberry Pi and all this stuff. It worked, and we kept the store of value element of it relatively good. And there's quite an established path to becoming sovereign on that, even if you start with ETFs or something ridiculous like that, though actually that remains to be seen whether those guys can be redeemed or not. People that are just buying Bitcoin in the ETFs, or even worse via some proxy like MicroStrategy, that I don't think those people that's a far cry from them running a node and having sovereign fuck you money. I don't think that's coming. But so we're seeing a degradation there too. But when it comes to people adopting Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, it's just there's so much more interactivity required, and there's necessarily always a third party every time you do this. So that makes life difficult, because I will assert that if Bitcoin cannot be used, or for the most part isn't used as a sovereign medium of exchange, then the store of value factor of it dies with it. You need both of these things. Bitcoin is money, and money must do several things. And it's not good enough to just say gold is not money. Gold is a store of value, and that's it. And the fact that gold cannot be used as a medium of exchange in any practical sense is why gold is not money. Bitcoin has to be money. If it's just a store of value, then we just created gold again and got really rich because we invested in it before everyone realized what it was, which was a very, very rare, precious thing, which there cannot be arbitrarily more of it created. And because we discovered that early, we got rich, but that isn't going to really fix anything. It's just it's just a one-time only wealth transfer from people that maybe bought into an ideology and a community that had some great ambitions, but unfortunately it didn't turn out that way. That can be ultimately where Bitcoin ends up, and it's pretty likely because we've seen protocol capture happen before, because nothing survives the normie, and the normie is coming. There's maybe a scenario where the normie does not adopt Bitcoin and it remains this niche thing for a bunch of cypherpunks or paranoid crypto anarchists, as they've been called, in a derogatory way, like that would be a bad thing. But that's what keeps the network going, is these paranoid self-sovereign nutcases that refuse to trust third parties for anything. So what am I talking about here? I'm saying that I am asserting that if you cannot use Bitcoin if people refuse to use Bitcoin as a sovereign medium of exchange, which is evidenced by the fact that they are perfectly capable of doing it right now, making it more technically feasible in the future where transaction fees are really expensive doesn't fix anything, because transaction fees are really cheap at the moment. This is the point I keep trying to hammer into the heads of the Covenants Bros. The Covenants Bros are saying, in the future, if Bitcoin gets adopted and people are using it as a sovereign medium of exchange, transaction fees are going to get so high that everyone will be forced to stop doing that and using centralized third-party custodians, unless we can find a way to do that trustlessly and permissionlessly, which is what you get with coin pools. And I understand that argument, but the problem is, right now, if you end up in that scenario and then you have covenants and then you have coin pools and everyone starts using those, we're back to where we are today, where apparently no one wants to do it. I understand that the incentives and environment might shift in the future, but I don't think it's going to pan out. I don't think we're being honest with ourselves if we look at the fact that this poll says 94% of people are buying Bitcoin and then leaving it at that and watching it go up in terms of, it's not 100 Bitcoins for a house anymore. It's 4. It's or 6 or 7 Bitcoins, or however extravagant you want to go with your house. So the problem is it's not there, right? It's simply just the desire is not there, even among the fact that we're relatively pure ideologically at the moment. Bitcoin is still early in its timeline, and there are not many people using it yet. The medium of exchange really does mean the rest of the world needs to accept it, and it doesn't. And the fact that it doesn't makes life annoying. And then you have the fact that there's capital gains tax in nearly every jurisdiction whenever you spend Bitcoin, which makes it really impractical. Though on the flip side of that coin is it makes people engage in the medium of exchange thing under the table, which is kind of good. So as to some degree, I kind of appreciate it. But honestly, for me, I bought Bitcoin, and once I realized, it's a taxable event every time I spend it, pretty much everywhere except Switzerland and El Salvador, I'm just going to hodl it until the state dies and there's no one to insist that I pay them 40% or whatever the sodding capital gains tax is, when I sell it, or spend it rather. It's kind of like a forced hodl in that respect. So again, like I've made arguments before that, punitive treatment by the state is one of the most helpful things that can happen with Bitcoin. And I maintain that stance, which is why I'm so concerned about the supposed friendliness of Donald Trump and even RFK. I mean, RFK said the most perfectly horrific thing that sounds like a brilliant thing when he was advocating he came back with a bit more intelligence than this, but he said, I want to enshrine it into US law that the freedom for an American to run a Bitcoin node, and everyone was celebrating that. And I'm saying, why on earth would you ever want the American government defining what it means to run a node? In what scenario can with Bitcoin withstand hostile takeover attempts if the sanctioned node software you must use is what is defined in US law? To me, that sounds like the worst thing you could ever possibly ask for in any contentious scenario, you need to be free to run the renegade version of it. And Bitcoin's been in that situation multiple times now, where the default implementation is doing something against the wishes of the community, and a grassroots alternative to the node software everyone uses pops up and changes everything and gets us back on track. That's literally why we have a Lightning Network, because that happened. So in a scenario where the American government is saying you can run a Bitcoin node, they're conversely saying you can't run stuff that isn't a Bitcoin node, right? And they'll get to define what that is. And no, that sounds like a nightmare to me. So no, thank you. Yeah, this friendly treatment by this love affair between the U.S. government and Bitcoin is ultimately one of the worst things for it, because Bitcoin needs to survive in spite of the state and develop the tools necessary to make it possible to get around it and hide from it. And we have survived by running from them. That's just an essential part of it, and you have to flex the muscles. And if you can't flex the muscles, they become weak and useless. So right now you're looking at permissioned, regulated Bitcoin, and that becomes the norm for everyone as they onboard. Like, yeah, I mine what template I'm told to mine, and I don't get control of anything that goes in the blockchain, and I don't get custody of anything that comes out of it. And I pay less tax because I offer my hash rate as I lease it towards another miner. I don't mine for myself. And and I voluntarily even tell people that I'm using green energy so as to afford me some sort of tax break. Like, all these things are just utterly awful for the health of the system as a whole, and it's just become normalized. So I mean, you've only got a few. The hodl space is the only place really where people like have enough time, and they're just watching the price all day. That's the only place where people just sit there going, "Don't trust, verify," and stay humble, stack sats, and hodl, and run a node, and all these things we do in hodl culture. They don't exist in the mining space, and they don't exist in the corporate space. So if you've got Saylor and Wall Street and the U.S. government and various states all adopting strategic Bitcoin reserves, like there's nothing about that helps the system gain any strength. It can help add hash rate because the higher price justifies more people mining, but hash rate does not equal security unless you have the right kind of people doing it. If the hash rate all comes from regulated, blue-pilled North American publicly traded cucks, then they're not offering any security at all. They're offering a barrier of entry to people that might actually offer us some security, because security against what? Double spends and censorship. These are the people that are going to do that. They're not the people that are going to make life more difficult for someone else that wants to do it. They're exactly the kind of institution that will do all that. So, that's a massive tangent. I'm sorry for going off on that, because I'm really just talking about the sort of lie of the land with it. But I guess it ties back into the first topic, because the kind of people that are making memes about Bitcoiners once upon a time being like, yeah, subvert the state, Silk Road, Julian Assange. And now it's all, yay, Wall Street adoption, strategic Bitcoin reserve, ETF, baby. Like, the kind of people that are poking fun of the culture for apparently having become, well, if I'm going to be generous to us, a victim of its own success, or if I'm going to be, dismissive of us, complete sellouts. Either way, however you want to put it, the people making memes about that are all disgruntled big blockers and Bcashers. And first off, if Bcash had been the thing that had taken off, you're all going to get infested with normies and have exactly the same cultural corruption too. So Bitcoin was always going to become a victim of its own success. The normies are coming. Brace yourself. Is always a thing anyone's going to have had to accept as an eventual possibility. Nothing stays good when a billion normies adopt it. Nothing can survive that. Sorry. But nonetheless, they're making memes and saying Bitcoin was captured. It's not usable as a medium of exchange anymore. Somehow, these people have the ability to ignore the fact that it still only costs a few cents every time you make a transaction on the Bitcoin network. Because the fact is just people don't really want to do it, which means there's If you want to go and stand in line at the restaurant, there's only one person in front of you and it's moving very quickly. So, I mean, I don't know how they can put the wool over their own eyes there, but they think it was just a mistake in approach when we didn't just try and make the block size as big as possible, as quickly as possible, so as not to hinder the adoption of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. But Bitcoin is not being adopted as a medium of exchange, and block size is obviously not a factor in that because the blocks are perfectly permissive to way more transactions happening than are actually happening. Yes, they're all full, but they're all full of basically as close to free transactions as you might possibly get. I mean, it's going to cost you a few cents to get a transaction in the blockchain. How much does it cost the vendor every time you buy a cup of coffee with a credit card? More than a few cents, for sure. So let's stop pretending that it isn't functional as a medium of exchange right now. It isn't future-proofed, but it's definitely functional now and no one's using it. So this is my crusade for 2025, guys. Bitcoin it has to be adopted as a medium of exchange, but all of the barriers that people have implied all of the things people have said are barriers for it in the past, whether it's block size or whether it's the lack of covenants, are not the main factor. The main factor is the will is not there. People do not want to use it in that capacity, and they aren't. And I don't know how you fix that problem, and I don't know if it is fixable. And it is an issue because if it isn't adopted that way, if people aren't going to use it as a sovereign medium of exchange, ultimately 21 million loses its value too. And that's a fact. Because if and when it gets adopted as a global standard and people start using it as a medium of exchange in some compromised fashion, 21 million doesn't mean anything because the regulatory capture that will exist around the trusted third parties that everyone uses, whoever the Facebook equivalent is of Bitcoin wallets that everyone has to sign up an account with to be able to transact, whoever that is, there's going to be so few companies that do it, that are allowed to do it and operate like that, that they get to say how much Bitcoin there actually is. And that's it. They're not going to, even if you insist that everything they do ends up on chain, ultimately, they don't have to abide by that. So I've already seen plenty of systems like that internally, right? On ShakePay is a Bitcoin exchange in Canada. You have an account on ShakePay and you can send Bitcoins to other people on ShakePay by using their handle. There's no on-chain reflection of you having moved money from A to B. You imagine yourself to have just done a Bitcoin transaction, but nothing happened on-chain. And this isn't Lightning, where you still have the ultimate fallback of Bitcoin itself telling you that something has happened and money has been sent from A to B. You don't have that with a third-party ledger maintained by a centralized regulated entity. So you're going to have all that. And it's gonna be the same as everything else with the ups and downs of the whole thing. You'll have crash, boom, bust cycles, and that will lead to consolidation, fewer and fewer and fewer companies, and eventually you do end up with just the big four or whoever it is, a very small handful of people that are basically responsible for all of the payment processing in Bitcoin, and it may or may not have anything to do with what happens on the blockchain. And I'm insinuating that it won't have anything to do with what happens on the blockchain. And this is, again, it's not a technological failure. Though in that scenario, if that happens and people keep getting rugged, then there might be some genuine people calling out for covenants and what they offer in that scenario. And obviously it would be good to prepare for that, or to take a prophylactic approach and build in this technology while we're still in our nascent form and it's more doable to add soft forks and there are less people we need to convince of the need for them. I understand all that and as an approach, and I don't really have much better of an alternative to propose at this moment, but I do think it's valid to point out that for whatever reason, the will, people have the will to use Bitcoin as a store of value and to do so in a sovereign way. So if you buy a bunch of Bitcoin and you leave it all on an exchange, there are millions of us yelling at you that you're going to get rugged and you're an idiot, and it's going to cost you less than $1,000 to be completely sovereign and have the Swiss bank account in your pocket. Like, this is known, it's part of our culture, and we are incredibly patient and persistent when it comes to advocacy for doing that. and we even have all the help of exchanges continually collapsing and robbing everyone that doesn't listen to that message. So we're doing all right in that regard. But when it comes to I can't push people to use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange in a sovereign capacity because no one in the world accepts it anywhere yet. And acceptance is not hindered by anything other than the fact that mediums of exchange typically haven't been stores of value. So the two things have been separated. People store their value in stuff. Like if you're dumb, you store it in the fiat currency, but everyone with money only keeps their money or their value if they're using assets instead, and assets aren't a store of value. In Bitcoin, you have the store of value is the medium of exchange, whereas in our day-to-day life, they have been separated. Oh, you got a massive redundancy check at work. You got a massive amount of this medium of exchange. Okay, let's talk about how you turn that into a store of value. Okay, you're going to invest in this and that and the other. But no one sees the medium of exchange as the store of value, and no one sees the things they're using to store value as mediums of exchange because they aren't. So in Bitcoin, the two are interlinked and must be used as one system as they self-reinforce. And but they cannot undermine one another because they don't work in perfect harmony. But you cannot let one fall to the wayside. And this is the ultimate me sounding the alarm, right? I don't think there's much systemic risk to Bitcoin that's capable of taking the thing down or making it unrecognizable or terrible. I think if the worst happened with mining, we've built enough stuff out now with Ocean and Datum that we could survive it. If the US government came around and told Foundry and the Chinese government in cahoots with them told Bitmain, you have to start censoring transactions, and they did it, and none of the miners moved, and the Bitcoin price went up because everyone's such a cuck that they enjoy the increased regulatory environment and the permission of it all and the clarity, I still think we could survive that, because when that inevitably becomes more and more expensive to be inside that regulatory moat, miners are going to profit more and more by stepping outside of it and mining on the permissionlessly. So I think that would work. I think we would survive it. I wouldn't like to be in that scenario, but I do think we survive it, which is great. So happy about all that. It's a fierce battle that we have not won yet, but I'm not that worried about it. If Ocean hadn't become a thing, and if Datum hadn't been written, and if it had been but no one was adopting it, or it wasn't working, or something like that, if it was too theoretical, then I'd be worried. But I see Datum blocks once every 35 hours or something. I see a miner-made block, and miners, if you can decentralize block template creation down to the miner level rather than the pool level where it's been for 10 years, then we stand a fighting chance with that. And that makes me relax a little bit. Again, grateful to Luke for having spearheaded another initiative that keeps Bitcoin. But yeah, the medium of exchange, the lack of adoption of Bitcoin as a medium of exchange is genuinely alarming, because right now we just have it yelling at us in the face. It's perfectly possible. The technical complexity isn't there because you can just use layer 1 right now because it's so cheap. So it's cheap. And there's no complexity. You don't need to use Lightning. You don't need to manage channels. You don't need to do anything remotely interactive. You just move some of your HODL into a hot wallet. You ask someone for a Bitcoin address, and you send Bitcoin to that address. That's it. And if you have privacy concerns, you can use a CoinJoin wallet, and those are around. There's more than one implementation, right? So the fact that it's that trivial and people still aren't doing it, I don't know how to fix that. And I think we're coping with the fact that no one's doing that by trying to make it more technically feasible for people to do it, to come up with solutions to problems that will exist in the future. But if the problems don't exist today, adding a solution to that problem isn't going to fix anything, because apparently there's nothing to fix right now. Covenants fix the problem of, well, they do have some good privacy implications, but they fix the problem of I need to share a UTXO. I need to get more efficiency out on my on-chain activity because it's prohibitively expensive for me if I don't. At the moment, it is not prohibitively expensive to use L1, and people are not doing it. So we are fixing a problem that is not yet manifest. So and because we're ignoring the greater problem. And the greater problem, which I vow to focus on in anything I do that is not in the capacity I work at Ocean, all I want to do inside Bitcoin now is focus on its utility as a medium of exchange. And I can see the like three B cachers that insist on watching this channel for whatever reason, probably because they still mostly own Bitcoin. Most B cachers still own Bitcoin, but it's going to be, small block Tard has epiphany 10 years later that Bitcoin needs to function as a medium of exchange. I don't mind if you want to dunk on me for that. And maybe I should have been more vocal about this in the past. But as I just think it's worth being honest about this. It's not a new realization to me. It's just more that I'm seeing, like this poll that Jimmy did, and like the arguments I have with the Covenants people, and like the state of my mempool at the moment, and yours too. The state of our mempools implies that no one wants to use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, and the state of the state of the Covenants bros arguments are we're constantly invoking a disaster scenario in the future that we won't ever get to because no one is, we're not trending in that direction currently. The trend is for the blockchain to remain basically almost free. Like, I can't believe if we're in this scenario, like I've already said, with Bitcoin on the world stage, winning in front of everyone and still no one really wanting to access the blockchain, then combine that with what I said about, the way everyone's mempools are looking. And I just think it's time to accept it. There's something that is not clicking for people. The store of value component of Bitcoin is really easy to explain. I know 99% of people still don't get it, but the 1% that do, amazingly, they're able to have you hold a piece of paper in front of them that says, hey, look, plus 10,000% in short time frame. Most people are able to look at that, if they're not completely just up to the eyeballs in government propaganda and mainstream media, corrupt narratives and all that crap. Eventually people look at that and go, yeah, all right, I get it. I'll store some value in it. But medium of exchange, I don't know how you do that, because all you're selling to people is, hey, this is less convenient than your current thing. And from the merchant's perspective, it's much more complicated, but actually it saves them some money on credit card fees. But that's kind of negligible because what you're paying them is so volatile that, it's not for the most part, the volatility is going to nuke any sort of saving you might make from not getting paid via Visa, plus the additional complexity of having to figure out how to use the thing. So yeah, I'm looking at it all. I'm looking at how I would like for B cachers to dunk on me for this. I don't think it's correct to do so, but I don't mind trying to bring people who are naturally have the same goals in mind to working together. And I hate the fact that there's these divides in Bitcoin's community where people are trying to do the same thing. The most annoying one that I'm most personally involved in is the anti-spam crowd, the monetary maxis, and the people pushing covenants became immediate enemies when they're both trying to increase Bitcoin's ability as a payment network rather than just a store of value. They're both fighting the same battle, and immediately, like, it was infuriating to me that happened, because covenants are basically a fundamentally useful technology to have if you want Bitcoin to be usable as a permissionless medium of exchange. So I'm fundamentally in favor of them, and I'm arguing with the people pushing for them because they're all trying to undermine this. For the most part, anyway, they all seem to take this hostile attitude towards fixing the spam filters in the default implementation. And it's been a really stupid fight to be having for ages. But ultimately, I would like to reconcile it. And I would even like to reconcile with big blockers. I'd never disagreed. No small blocker disagreed that it wouldn't be great if we could have big blocks without the trade-off. The argument for us that never got resolved technically was, hey, big blockers, can you please acknowledge the trade-offs with making big blocks without flippantly saying hard drives are getting cheaper every year and bandwidth is improving every year? Can you understand that there is a lot more degradation that happens to the network that comes with making blocks bigger than, oh, I needed a bigger solid state drive and I needed to upgrade my internet connection? That is not the only issue that comes with making blocks bigger. And I could never, ever get a single one of you ever to engage in a genuine capacity with that. It would always just, you would always just start making appeals to nonsense about Blockstream and about governments taking over and pushing agendas and all this absolute nonsense that's all just social and political arguments. None of you would ever stay on the technical elements of it, which is what happens when a giant pool is producing 100 megabyte blocks and you're mining in a region that doesn't allow it, so you're using the Tor network. Like, do you understand the subtle things like that? If you we have this horrible incentive for the big pool to become bigger and the small pools to become smaller, so that you have, and given how much of what pools do is way overstepping the boundaries anyway, making blocks bigger ultimately just makes that problem so much worse. And then there's the fact that you're never going to make blocks big enough to be able to contain all of the world's transactions, so some other method is needed, and there just isn't the need, because blocks are clearly big enough at the moment, that we're not struggling. So these were the arguments that they never made, or they never ever listened to. They were always just say, Bitcoin's been captured. People are not, they're suffocating Bitcoin and not allowing it to change in the way that it needs to be changed. And hard disk space and bandwidth are improving every year. Like, they'll tell you, oh, I could buy 2 terabytes now for less than I could buy 1 terabyte back in 2016. Problem solved. This is not a serious approach to the problem on a technical level at all. And it really frustrates me, and I wish big blockers would have. There was one big blocker famously that realized he was wrong about all this. He was the bear whale that sold 30,000 Bitcoins in like October 2015. That was fun. So I don't know. Go and look up that video if you haven't seen it. It's called "The Slaying of Man Bear Whale," I think is what it's called. So yeah, medium of exchange is. I think we've reached the point where Bitcoin is acknowledged as a store of value, potentially by. It's been acknowledged as a store of value by some of the most rich people on the planet who are using it as such. And it's going to do that black hole thing where it sucks in all of the monetary premium from everything else. And it's just going to be a runaway freight train in that sense. But the wheel will come off if no one's using it as a medium of exchange anymore. And that's the heartbeat of Bitcoin. Every transaction that happens where people are moving coins from one person to another person, every time that happens, that's the pulse of it. That's what keeps ultimately this dead, lifeless, like the form of Bitcoin. If I can be poetic for a minute, the form of it, the body. You ever heard that expression, you are energy carrying around a corpse? That's what life is, right? And no one can define it, and no one knows where one begins and the other ends. The form of Bitcoin is the sovereign money aspect, the sovereign store of value aspect. That's the shape of it. That was set in stone from the beginning. Then the thing that makes it stay alive is the monetary aspect, the medium of exchange within that. That is why, because every time you spend coins and every time a person verifies that they've received it, that's what maintains the 21 million value. And if the person isn't verifying properly, if the medium of exchange users aren't, if the two parties are relying on a third party to give permission to this thing and to add and to do some sort of crappy version of verification for it, that's not a reiteration and a recommitment to the fact that there are 21 million Bitcoins anymore. That's accepted as a given, even though it's no longer being reinforced. So that's how the thing starts becoming old. That's how its DNA falls apart, and that's how suddenly this form becomes no longer a form, but becomes, a once lofty goal that we once aspired to, that we've lost the ability to maintain any integrity to, and it just sort of slowly melts away and becomes a distant memory. Oh, do you remember 21 million? Yeah, that was nice. How many Bitcoins are there now? No idea. But my JP Morgan wallet says I have some coins because you just sent me some. At that point, you're just back to gold again. The reason gold doesn't work is because it's not practical as a medium of exchange. So everyone uses third parties, which means that it becomes vulnerable to capture, confiscation, censorship, and it loses the store of value component because people start trading paper that's supposed to reflect gold that isn't really there. Now, Bitcoin's better than that, but it's not perfect. It can still suffer the same fate. There's no threshold here. It's just how much better than that or how much worse than that are you? Gold is really bad because it's really impractical as a medium of exchange. Bitcoin's great as a medium of exchange, but if it's not, for now anyway, it's not future-proof in that regard. But if you unwind that and say, well, no one's actually going to use it that way. The way people use Bitcoin is very much reminiscent of the way people used gold. Then it's going to suffer the same fate as gold. It's not going to be an effective store of value anymore. Though, I mean, again, this is where it gets worse. Bitcoin's a lot worse than gold, because if everyone stops using gold as a medium of exchange, which they basically have, doesn't mean suddenly that the laws of physics that maintain the scarcity of gold suddenly change. Yeah, it has ramifications for the mining aspect of it, but your gold will remain gold if no one uses it as a medium of exchange, if you had the foresight to take custody of it yourself, right? And gold has maintained purchasing power relative to everything else for hundreds of years, right? Bitcoin doesn't have that quality. If Bitcoin doesn't get used as a medium of exchange, the way I'm advocating for, right, not in some corner cutting method, eventually the properties that maintain 21 million, they're not maintained by laws of physics or anything like that. Those just melt away, right? So you can't rest on your laurels like that. So this approach that I'm advocating for and this mentality that I'm pushing for comes from it comes after a lot of reflection and a lot of looking at what Bitcoin's good at and what it's not good at. But this has been a long time in the making, and people are approaching Bitcoin like it's gold. If you discovered gold when it was only worth $1 each, and then you bought loads of it knowing it would be worth $10,000 per whatever unit, per kilogram, or whatever a kilogram of gold costs. You can tell I'm not a gold bug. I have no idea what the price of a kilo of gold is. But the point is, you could buy that and you could be confident in the fact that if some payment network was built on top that used paper for people to trade gold amongst each other without the inconvenience of having to use the physical gold, you could be confident that if whatever company that was fell apart, your gold is going to be molecularly stable and there's not going to be a bunch of fake gold suddenly exist as a result of it or something like that. Bitcoin doesn't have that. So this is like, if I can do the job of gold bugs for them that they never do properly, this is ultimately where their distrust of something that's digital is warranted, right? Because if the world loses confidence in Bitcoin, it's not just that you have 10,000 Bitcoins out of 21 million, and isn't that great? Because I still have 10,000 Bitcoins out of 21 million, even if the price of it tanked 99%, I still have it. No, you have 10,000 Bitcoins according to a set of rules that no one enforces anymore, which means you might as well not have any of them, or you might as well have infinity of them, right? The amount of gold you have relative to the rest of the gold out there is fixed, even if it hasn't all been mined or not yet. But alchemy doesn't exist. You can't make gold out of another element. That's limited by the laws of physics, right? But it's obviously, we know the total supply of gold is very approximate because we don't know how much is out there, and the amount that gets mined depends on the price. So you have all these vague things, right? Bitcoin comes along and says, no, we're better than that because we're harder money. We know there's only 21 million, and you can know exactly how much you own as a percentage of that. But the thing that enforces that value is ultimately just us, and it's only reinforced by the way in which we interact with the other facets of it. So if the other stuff all falls to the wayside, if you try and treat Bitcoin like it's a stable thing like gold, and the other elements of how it can be used are treated as unimportant, and the rights are just not exercised and the muscles not flexed, then it stops being anything like gold at all. It just becomes a complete farce. So, I mean, I find that stunning to point out. But Bitcoin is not hard money unless it's used actively by people who are asking permission from no one. That's the only way it maintains it. And I mean that with regards to storing it, taking custody of it themselves, and using it as a permissionless medium of exchange. If they don't do the latter, which it sounds like 94% of people no longer do, and they would be some of the most hardcore Bitcoiners around, If that's the case and the trend is away from using it as a medium of exchange, then ultimately 21 million is not going to mean anything. And this is not undue pessimism, and this is not I'm not trying to be a whataboutist or just trying to create doom porn. This is real. I really mean this. Sincerely, you do not have longevity with Bitcoin. You're not going to make it to the year 2140. You're not going to see cycle after cycle after cycle of adoption if the the medium of exchange use case is neglected. And right now it is being neglected by us. We're not using it as a medium of exchange. Demonstrably, that is the case. And technical solutions to that, like the joke of making blocks bigger or the far more serious approach of adding covenants, neither of those are going to fix the fundamental lack of will. So I don't know what we do in that regard. I'm going to start thinking about how to tell people, not your keys, not your coins. All right, I have to take custody of it. What's the equivalent of that in the medium of exchange world? How do you start making that a mantra? How do you tell people to spend it? And I don't want any pushing back. Like, is it spedden? Do we need to make that? I mean, SPEDN. Is that what has to happen? People need to start spending it. And they have a horrible environment where capital gains tax exists. And I mentioned that already, but yada, yada. I'm going to end the video there because I don't have a solution to propose exactly, but I definitely think it's worth identifying the problem like that. And I hate this silo effect that's happened where the medium of exchange maxis have all decided Bitcoin's corrupt and, Blockstream corrupted it or whatever. And then that caused backlash amongst the people that like Bitcoin proper. And, are now doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on it being a new store of value. And our new champion, our hero, Michael Saylor, that's all he ever talks about. The guy couldn't care less about, I've always said this about Saylor. He understands what makes Bitcoin amazing, and he is completely clueless about how to make it remain amazing. He undermines every single facet of what gives it the stability he celebrates so much. Bitcoin can vaporize into thin air very quickly because it's not the things that maintain it are us and the way we use it. And if people's interactivity with Bitcoin is limited to once a month, I stack some corn and it goes into cold storage and that's it. Again, the fact that you're not using it as a medium of exchange is not maintaining the integrity of the system anymore. So the 21 million limit will become advisory. It won't become hard anymore. So this is just, I hope I've explained it well enough. I hope that doesn't sound like a leap where I haven't explained every step of it. But I fundamentally assert it to be a fundamental truth in Bitcoin. If people en masse are not using it as a medium of exchange, whether it's technically feasible or not, because it's feasible right now, if they are not going to do that, if more than 90% of Bitcoiners are just using it as a store of value and not as a medium of exchange, it stops functioning as a store of value. I assert that, and I challenge anyone to tell me that that's not true in the long term. I agree it might be fine for now, and the price might continue to go up, and we'll have another 2, 3, 4 cycles of fun where we keep adding zeros onto our net worth. But ultimately, I don't think that is not what we're here for. We're definitely here for a bigger purpose than that, which is actually to create perfect money. And creating perfect money means having a perfect monetary network at the same time, not just a perfect store of value. A perfect store of value is just, it's not about, making an immaterial version of gold that can be stored in your head or something like that. That is not the only requirement. People talk about, the intangible component of it. It solves a big problem of confiscation, but it doesn't solve it. It doesn't solve it. It just helps with it, right? Because again, if everyone's using third-party custodians because they're the only way for you to use it as a medium of exchange, and that is demonstrably what most people are doing, then it might as well be gold in a vault. And we need to do so much better than that. So yeah, this is it. This is the new cause to champion in Bitcoin. It's nothing to do with what I'm doing at Ocean, which is all about mining. Obviously, it's pulling in the same direction, with the big picture goal of making Bitcoin work the way us cypherpunks want it to work. But the problem is that most people are just not cypherpunks, and they will not use this thing as a cypherpunk should, and therefore it will become unusable for someone who is a cypherpunk. That's it. That's all I have to say on the topic. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for, I've seen this channel grow a lot over the last year or two. Um, and I'm really appreciating the feedback. I read pretty much everything that's written here. I don't really respond to many of the comments because I think Twitter is a better place to have backs and forths. I really don't like feeding the beast that is Google. I obviously massively dislike what's going on with Elon in a lot of ways, but this is not going to be an Elon rant. But for now, Twitter remains the best place for back and forth for discussions on these things. Yeah, thanks for watching the channel. Happy New Year, everyone. And if you're looking for the next mission to fight in Bitcoin, this is the one where medium of exchange becomes a priority. Yeah, all right. Thanks so much and have a great celebration tonight.